Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about No More Alert 1, which is moving from demonstrating that a vulnerability exists to actually showing how somebody would exploit it when you're writing penetration testing reports. There'll be a couple of examples of live attacks that we pulled off in real life engagements. I'll be talking about how you should probably start structuring reports, and there'll be a little bit of kind of taking the piss out of people as we go through, which should be good fun. Boring stuff out of the way. I'm Liam. I'm a senior development consultant at Pentest People. I'm the systems architect at Dark Invader, and I volunteer as the IT director at Trust Leads. I specialise in pen testing and offset development, and with a love of breaking stuff that's only grown since I was a child. I was a bit of a terror in school, as you might have imagined. You can see all my social stuff on the screen there. Twitter is just me rambling, but the GitHub has some pretty cool tools for any pen testers out there, and you can email me any questions, queries, or cat pictures. Please don't sign me up to the dodgy websites, though. While it's very funny, I don't want to see all those emails come through. So, jumping right into it, modern beauty standards. So, the first thing we're going to touch upon here is how pen testers should be putting together incredibly informative proof of concepts. The badly cropped nessus output is a thing of the past, and welcome to the red team version of makeup palettes and Photoshop. More seriously, how many people here have viewed a report that either doesn't fully explain the issues it describes, or the associated proof of concepts don't really show how the vulnerability would legitimately be exploited? Judging by the title of this talk, you can tell which one's going to be the prime example of that. Pretty POCs. How do we make our screenshots look clean and professional? I'll save everyone the bother of reading out what's behind me. I think we can all read, or at least I hope so. And I appreciate this is incredibly basic advice, but as any consultant worth their salt can tell you, the clearer a report is, the less questions you're going to get asked about it, and thus the more efficiently you can work. There's nothing worse than being dragged into an hour-long meeting, which could have been avoided if you just stuck a little box around the bit of the proof of concept the client needed to focus on. Similarly, avoiding having your abilities questioned by making screenshots look a little bit more technical is something everyone's imposter syndrome could deal with. I know everybody suffers from it. So, Liam, all your other stuff is in grey. Why use green for your reports, like this one? Well, two reasons. The first one is that it was, when I first started out, I worked for a company called Pentest People, and that was the employer's colours. So it just made the report look a little bit more thematic. Feel free to do the same when you wander out into the fabulous world of pen testing yourself, and that makes the reports just look more cohesive. The other element is that teachers have now been instructed to use green pens when marking work, as it softens the blow and doesn't look confrontational. Now, that might seem slightly silly, but any pen testers in the room? Anyone? One or two? How many times have you got into arguments with clients because they don't like the work you've done because you've ripped to a new one? Yeah, lots of nods. Exactly. This just helps soften the blow. It helps ease them into it. The absolute, clients at times do forget that we're working towards the same goal, and if your proof of concepts can avoid alienating them further, this will again reduce the amount of time spent working on client relationships when what you want to be doing is performing high quality security testing. We'll get on to more of those client relationships in a little bit. I've got some funny stories. Next one. Nice white box redacts the live password for the application. Why do we include redaction in our reports? Well, firstly, in this example, this is a live password to their application that's been exfiltrated via a cross-site scripting attack I'm going to be showing you in a little bit. The full attack chain for this, as I said, will be shown later, but giving highly sensitive information like this out is highly ill-advised. Generally, the person who receives the report will then chop it into little bits and send it out to internal security teams. These teams do not need to know these passwords, nor should they. Similarly, that password could be used across any of the other services that the person who's fallen victim to our attack has created. To avoid any accusations of malpractice then, because somebody logs into your Facebook accounts and starts posting all kinds of ridiculous things on there, it's easier just to redact it. It removes any accusation from there. Nobody can accuse you or anybody that's then had the report of being dodgy. And clients just like it, like them have a little bit more clean. Naturally, supplying passwords separately to appropriate individuals can be sorted out, but don't do it in the main body of your report, and have a conversation with the client before you start doing anything like that. The test SSL problem. The first thing we'll touch upon here is how pen testers should be putting together incredibly informative proof of concepts. That's kind of the basis of the whole talk. Test SSL is a kind of unique problem because it's something that you run on basically every engagement, and it provides loads of really, really good information that you can use to inform clients and security teams. And the screenshot that everybody always uses from it is that one, which just gives absolutely no more information than the nessus scan you've probably run, which is why you're running test SSL in the first place. And I'll admit, I do run it on all my engagements. There have been innumerable instances during my career when I've received a pen test report, and the screenshot behind you is given as evidence, although I use the term rather loosely here. Firstly, test SSL is the first 5 tools on any script kiddie's Git cloning spree. Try saying that 5 times fast. But I'll come back to that. More importantly, it doesn't offer the kind of hands-on technical information that clients respond well to. This screenshot actually provides less information than Nessus does, which in and of itself is a bit of a feat. To return to my previous comment, clients love to see expertise, especially when you're charging potentially thousands of pounds for your time. When I've been in the position of a client, which has happened a few times, seeing proof of concepts like this just scream lack of effort. When you're delivering tests yourself, it's imperative that clients feel they are getting a true expert working for them, and upping the quality of your proof of concepts is the safest way of doing this. Again, with the imposter syndrome. So, whilst only being slightly more technical, and again, featuring some beautiful green boxes that I hope all of you will be using in future, the above shows SSL scan and OpenSSL to prove the same vulnerabilities as the previous sites. Even whilst only being slightly more technical, they clearly give more information, and the green boxes allow attention to be drawn to the relevant sections of each screenshot. The OpenSSL command is given as well, and can be given in write-ups to allow clients to replicate the finding themselves. As an aside there, don't be scared, especially when you're engaging clients like this, of giving away some of the technical advice you know. There's nothing massively secretive about what we do in pen testing. Most of it can be found on Git repositories like Hattrix, or even in Nessus write-ups or Metasploit themselves. Hiding this information from people doesn't make you look doesn't shroud you in this aura of mystique that you think it might do. It just makes you look like you've got something to hide, which you don't. You can show these commands, and they're quite nice. Check yourself. What is the best way to get in trouble with NCSC? It's to use Nessus output in reports. NCSC, for all their faults, understand that running a Nessus scan does not a pen tester make. More importantly, Nessus itself is prone to false positives, normally the number one download for a budding security enthusiast. This isn't a knock on newcomers to the industry. We all started somewhere, and some of us ruined 200 sheets of paper that your dad had just bought by running a custom Nessus profile against a printer. Oops. Sorry about that one, Dad. But there is a wealth of information to learn in IT security, and if the first thing you learn is how to get awesome POCs, you'll be stood in good stead. Talk a little bit more about Nessus now. More importantly, especially once you move from that introduction to security stage and start performing your own engagements, especially for slightly larger clients who have a bit more of an understanding of security themselves, the clients own Nessus. They run it themselves. They run it on their networks. That's why they're getting a penetration test, is they see a load of red come up in a Nessus scan and they call you in a panic. They can normally see the scanner output because either they've run it or it's the first thing that comes up when you Google the name of a vulnerability. It's normally the Tenable Nessus article, or you might even link to it yourself in your report. And as I said before, Nessus is prone to false positives. It doesn't catch everything, and you need to be checking these things. More manual proof of concepts. I appreciate we all work in computers, so the concept of a manual proof of concept is slightly odd, but the point still stands. To reiterate, demonstrating expertise is incredibly important as a pen tester in a consulting role. Again, when I have been a client and seen copy and pasted Nessus output in reports, it immediately raises red flags about the ability of the tester and how reputable the business that employs them is. Don't use Nessus output. But Nessus is a great tool. Now, alert 1. Why the hate? So, no points for guessing what I think of this old chestnut. The title has, as I've said before, given that one away. Alert 1 is a shining example of not demonstrating exploitability properly. There are 1,000,001 things you can do with a cross-site scripting exploit, and showing a little one in a pop-up box does not do it justice. Coming up with some real-life examples of exploits that are pulled off on client engagements, but for now, let's discuss a little bit more about why this is such a big bugbear of mine. Really can't ramp home how important it is not to be using Alert 1, and please excuse the facetious infographic, but when you're delivering a pen test report, the client needs to be able to see, as I've said, and will continue to say, needs to be able to see how damaging something is from the screenshot. Alert 1 just doesn't do that. So that quote right there is actually the reason I'm stood before you today. I fell into the trap a number of years ago, I will hastily add now, of using Alert 1 in a report. Now, at the time, I knew no better. To a pen tester, seeing that 1 in a box adequately demonstrates the presence of a vulnerability. And most, if not all, pen testers then know the various ways you can seriously harm an application from there. However, this project manager had absolutely no idea. An eye-opening experience, if ever there was one, based on my newfound discovery that I needed to start not just making information clear in POCs, which I've covered on the previous couple of slides, putting boxes around things, redacting them, making them look pretty, but also to start demonstrating exactly the damage that could be caused by them. I dove headfirst into Stack Overflow and drowned myself in JavaScript and managed to freak myself out by how much there was to learn there, but we'll get on to some real-life examples of things that have actually been carried out on client engagements and how they can inform the way you start performing these kinds of attacks moving forward. Chasing the rabbit. Part 1 is cross-site request forgery, and we have a part 2 which is reflected cross-site scripting, and a part 3 which is breaking anti-automation controls, or rather automating attack chains. Now, before we dive into this, quick explanation on cross-site request forgery. It arises because of a problem of how browsers treat cross-origin requests. Take the following example. A user logs into site1.com. The application sets a cookie called authCookie. A user then visits site2.com. Site2.com makes a request to site1. The browser sends the authCookie along with it. Now, normally, it doesn't really matter if it's a GET request, the page is served, same origin policy stops any funny business. Very, very hard to deal with that. If Site2 makes a post request instead, or if it's a series of very specific post requests, that request came from the same computer as the valid session and uses the same authentication cookie. There's no real way to tell the difference, and so any state-changing operation can start to be performed. Pretty sure that was a whistle-stop tour across that request forgery. There's some great articles online if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Now, you can technically prove that a function is vulnerable to cross-site request forgery using Burp Suite, the most common application security tool out there, in 5 clicks. I know, I'm really sad, I counted. But that is rarely the most damaging attack vector, just changing a name or something like that. By combining a very specific instance of CSRF with HTML, we can demonstrate the real-world danger to the client. Now, this horror story that I'm going to walk you through over the next couple of slides happened back in August of 2020. On the application I was assessing, admins had the ability to add web pages, which was a pretty reasonable action for the application in question. Unfortunately, the action of adding a page was vulnerable to cross-site request forgery. Not so good. The attack that I'm about to walk you through not only created a new page, which is exactly what you do if you just right-click, generate CSRF proof of concept in Burp and fire it off, but it also stole administrative credentials. I need more coffee. Also stole administrative credentials from the site using a little bit of unorthodox HTML, and oddly enough, we then had to go back in after the engagement and remove all of this because of the way the injection parameter worked. If you couldn't remove it from the GUI or the website, you had to upstream proxy it and then trigger a delete request. So, fully exploiting cross-site request forgery, stage 1. Here you can see here you can see a little bit of unorthodox HTML, right? The iframe is, the source is set to the logoff page, the idea is the attack frame, and the border is none, and then you can see that we're setting the window outer height and window outer width. Now, interestingly enough, what happens if you iframe a logoff path that normally would just be firing a GET request? Well, it logs you out and deauthenticates your cookie, but importantly, it doesn't change the entire page. It just redirects the contents of the iframe, which is an important bit here, and something that we're going to be using to, be a little bit nefarious. that becomes more important because whilst you can visually make it look, as we're doing here, that the whole page has been rewritten, any malicious JavaScript that we're actually running in the background is still going to be there, but we don't have to make it persistent using another method. It just sits there and ticks over. Another important thing, document.body.inner.html completely nukes the body of a page, but you can actually use document.getElements by type name html0.innerHTML if you need to remove more of the DOM, but that was a bit long and made my screenshot look bad, so I didn't use it. The width and height parameters are nicely calculated using the outer height and outer width. That's reasonably simple stuff. Right. We've now logged the user out, and they're staring at a random page that the logout function on this particular app redirected to. What are we going to do now? Well, we really want the keys to the kingdom. Now, technically, you can only access this page if you, one, knew the path, or two, were an admin clicking around through the CMS. So we're going to go after admin creds, because why not? Let's have some fun. We've already fiddled around JavaScript a bit to get here, so let's fiddle around a little bit more. The onload property of an iframe comes in very handy here. It fires every time the iframe loads, or in fact, every time the iframe source changes, which comes in handy in a little bit. All we do is check what the current source of the iframe is, set to when it loads, then rewrite it to the admin login portal. Nice simple if statement for any of us who are deprogramming in the room, which should hopefully be most of us. They'll recognise that. And then the 3 equal signs versus the 1 equal sign as a comparison or a change of value. So, now we've got our page, and it's properly rendered on the admin login portal. Those all-important credentials are still not ours yet, so more nefarious JavaScript. We need to assign a function to the login button on /admin.aspx that grabs the values of the username and password fields and sends them back to our attacker-controlled server. It's fortunately pretty simple to do, as a vulnerable application uses jQuery as well. Firstly, changing our onload function so that it assigns the grab creds function to it. A handy function called addEventListener, which is nicely demonstrated up there, allows you to do that by just doing exactly what it says on the tin. Just add another event listener to the button. It'll do whatever it wants to do, but we've now got a second event listening on that, which is going to hopefully steal these credentials. As a side note, the normal rules of iframes don't apply when you're coming from the same domain, which in this case we are, and that's the same case for all cross-site scripting vulnerabilities as well, not just this one. Cross-site request forgery, similar principle. You're no longer bound by the same origin policy, and you can interact with the contents of iframes very, very easily. Now you can use this in other ways, which we have done before. So if there's no way you can log things out, or they're setting certain parameters, you can hide an iframe on the page and just use it to redirect to everything and just rip all the data out of it, especially if they're large CMSs and you want to see all kinds of crazy information that they're storing in there. You can do that in the background and fire them back off to a server. There's loads of stuff you can do with cross-site scripting, and unfortunately I'm only able to give 2 examples today. So the next one. This uses the age-old getElement by ID, which I'm sure if anyone's done a bit of XSS themselves, then they'll probably have used that at some point. Really simply, it just grabs the values from 2 input elements of the page. Note that you do have to first reference the iframe and then the contents of it, then the document model thereof before interacting with its actual contents, because they like to make it easy for you, don't they? Whoever came up with JavaScript, they've caused me more headaches than I care to admit. As the application was already running jQuery, you can, instead of building an XHR request manually, which is quite a decent chunk of code, you can just use jQuery has a nice wrapper for it. You can access using $.get normally, or sometimes it's jQuery.get, jQuery.post, whatever you want to do. The delimiter of ... is, it's my little joke. It's the Morse code for SOS. And by the time I'd finished this engagement, me and my colleague were working on there were about 4 or so critical severity findings, and with SQL injection and everything. So it felt apt at the time, but that was not something I can recommend. It doesn't help build those client relationships I was talking about. So now we have our injection part payload. A little known fact, at least it was little known to me at the time when I was originally starting to put these things together, is that the path of a URL is entirely controllable by client-side JavaScript via the use of history.replaceState, which you can see at the top of there. I use this to my advantage in order to make my exploit that much more believable. Handily enough, it also accepts path traversal commands, which is great. I'm not sure quite why that's happened, but here we are. So you can simply change what was a very long, complicated CMS path, which took you all, it was like add page, view state, whatever. And you just change it to admin.aspx. So even when you're looking at the page, or you look at the address bar, it looks exactly like it's supposed to. The remainder I have, of course, already discussed, but that's what it looks like in its entirety. And that is what happens if you click 5 times in Burp Suite. You get something that looks a little bit like this. It'll say the action, CMS add page, the methods post. It'll give everything there. The page content is where we stick our injection payload here. And whilst this is a very standard attack, the cross-site request forgery is very rarely given anything higher than CVSS 9.9 because you have to make somebody click on a link for it. And as soon as you're using social engineering to try and make anyone do anything, it's really hard to make it have that critical severity because you've got to trick someone. And whilst most people do click on links, there's a couple of other factors that come into play there. And so we tend to err on the side of not giving it that as a result of that. But it's a very cool 9.9. And that was that. In the engagement itself, when we were actually running this, I was left somewhat dumbfounded when the logs of the server we were using to capture all of these things registered another entry. I went, nah, that can't be right. I can't include it in here for obvious reasons. But an admin had actually logged in, had interacted with the page that we'd added, and had fallen for it. And a resounding success. However, it did make for an incredibly awkward phone call when I had to call that person and tell them what they'd fallen for. Oops, they said. This attack is testament to being able to demonstrate incredibly damaging attack vectors. And putting together the entire chain only took about 25 minutes or so, with a half-hour break because I missed a semicolon somewhere. Semicolons are the bane of everyone's existence. I see a couple of winces out in the audience. You all know. The client was, as you'd expect, or at least I hoped, very happy with the attack that we'd pulled off. We hadn't just gone right-click, cross-site request forgery and moved on. We'd actually demonstrated the need for solid JavaScript, HTML, and CSRF attack knowledge. And when we put that all together, we put together a little video for them, just stepping them through all these little parts, and we sent them the video. And if you can use videos as proof of concepts, that's even better, especially if you're more complicated attack chains. Nobody needs a video to explain TLS 1.0 to them, but for something a bit more like this, maybe it would come in handy just to see how people would fall for it and how you've really managed to add that social engineering aspect into it, or just to try and make it a little bit more believable. Right then, Chasing the Rabbit, part 2. We've got some reflected cross-site scripting here. So this next exploit comes from a particularly spicy reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability that was discovered in tandem with a colleague of mine called Kieran. So thank you, Kieran, for letting me use this here. And us bald guys have to look after one another. If you bald before 25, it's a pain. So now we get back to my almost vitriolic hatred of Alert 1. We discovered a reflected cross-site scripting injection point, but all we could get to pop was Alert 1. Even kind of Alert XSS, which I've seen a couple of people doing, bopping around there in the ether, that wasn't working for us. The injection point was available, authenticated, and it was in the URL as well, which makes this really quite especially interesting. So we really wanted to see exactly what we could do with this and try and tear it apart. So, understanding the problem. For the more seasoned programmers in the room, you may be aware of a function commonly referred to as JSONify. It comes in various other different functions. Great, got a couple of nods, got the name right. Yes. As a quick explanation for those who don't, it effectively takes a kind of complex string and makes them safe to be included in a JSON structure. The above uses Python's JSON.dumps to do the same thing. So we figured out that they were using that because it was actually being reflected inside of a JSON parameter in a script itself. So we figured it was probably using that. Now we just had to escape it. If at first you fail. So this is what happens when I tried to get clever and bypass this was never going to work with the Python example above you there, but it sometimes works on custom-coded applications, and there are some really good labs on Portswigger that demonstrate how you break out of character encoding like this. However, in our case, this wasn't working. We even tried graph accents as an attempt. That's a real long shot in the dark and hardly ever works, but we thought, why not? Let's go for it. No avail. So we were left with the problem of, to properly start exfiltrating data, generally you're going to want to send it somewhere. You don't want to keep it on their machine. You want to control it in some way or exfiltrate it in some way. So, and to do that, we were going to need to include strings into it. So how are we going to include strings when we couldn't use them in the body? Well, say hello to my little friend, string.fromCharCode. String.fromCharCode doesn't require any quotes, and fortunately returns a string object that can be then passed to any other function that requires a string very happily. Result. Now we can use strings. But what is our vector going to be? The application didn't set any of the recommended cookie security flags, and as it was an authenticated page, we were going to cut out the middleman and go straight to the keys for the kingdom, an auth cookie. Yes. Also, as a side note, don't join a shared Slack channel with a client and have your status as hacking fools and breaking rules, especially when you're performing an engagement for them. That's incredibly poor taste. Slap on the wrist for Liam. So now we can use our strings. Now to encode our payload. The easiest way to exfiltrate a cookie is to incorporate it into the path of a URL for a remote server and then just send a GET request to said URL. You can rip it out. You can use post requests. This is just a lot easier. We've already touched on how we send requests in the cross-site request forgery example we went through previously, and now we have a way of defining a URL by using string.fromCharCode. As yet another quick aside, there's an interesting thing to note about cross-site scripting that you can use to speed up your exploit generation, and that is, for XSS, your malicious code is executing locally. So you don't have to set up some server in AWS, configure it all, make sure it's really nice and secure, ask the client for their IPs, you can whitelist them so you're not getting hammered by everybody. You can just set up a local web server with python-m http.server, and quick and easy way of demonstrating how exfiltration would work. Therefore, as you can see above us, our payload here is going to be localhost port 8000. I whipped this up just so I could copy and paste it directly into the string.fromCharCode. I'm incredibly lazy and will spend 6 months automating a 5-second task, as I'm sure most of us would do. And this was one of those. It just grabs it, pushes it into an array, console.logs all of that, bang, copy and paste. Nice one. So, next part of the attack is writing the remainder of our payload. We've proved we can get the IPM port into a format we can use in a request. So we've cut all kind of forms of quotes out. We don't need them anymore. Now, how do we get to those all-important cookies? Fortunately, this is incredibly simple. If there are no cookie flags, and in this case there weren't any cookie flags, specifically the HTTP-only flag, which I'm sure anybody who's ever done a security course, or especially a web-based one, will have learned all about flags. It's a nice and simple document.cookie up there, can just be used to reveal all the cookies. So now we've got them all. Nice. Grabbed all the cookies. How are we going to incorporate them into our URL? Well, actually, we can draw on a lesson from Excel, of all things. Excel, I hear you say. Why on earth would you do that to yourself? And now, you don't have to spend long talking to me to figure out what I think of Microsoft and their technologies. However, you see, as I'm sure many of you in the audience were as well, I have played the fool a little bit in school, especially once I figured out that I could break computers, and it was something that I enjoyed, much to the chagrin of every teacher I ever had in all of my IT. So I started off writing malicious VBA macros, and one such macro came in very handy here. I used to distribute Excel spreadsheets to help people revise and things like that in school. And then some of them contained questions that definitely weren't stolen from actual exams the school was holding out. Not GCSEs, don't take any of those off of me, just internal ones. Good Lord. So I would incorporate them all in there, but if I was worried that they might fall into the wrong hands, so I wrote a little time bomb that took every cell in every sheet and just capitalised the first letter, which, when somebody reviews that doesn't look particularly malicious. And indeed, the people who then read the macro thought nothing of it. I'm dyslexic, after all, and most of this presumed was just me, another way of being lazy and automating something I should have done in the first place. But from a technology perspective, it read the value out of the cell, not the formula within it, and then split it into two, capitalised the first letter, and concatenated them back together. It's that last bit that's going to come in handy here. Right then, got our payload, our cookies, and our combination technique. So the combination technique is .concat, document.cookie, which is nice and simple. You have your first bit, you concat it into there. Awesome. We start with breaking out the initial script tags. So this is how our attack payload starts. We had a script tag, and if you injected a closed script tag into it, it broke out of the JSON structure and left a horrific mess, so you just had to put a little quote in there. This is, this is not taken from the application we're actually attacking, for obvious reasons. I can't show you that here, but the premise is the same. There was the little closed script tag we injected, then you had to open another one. We had our jQuery.get. They hadn't used the $ as a moniker for it, so we just used jQuery.get. String.from charcode, that all resolves, and then .concat document.cookie. Lovely stuff. This works thanks to order of operations, which goes deepest bracket, then left to right. And it nicely executes in the background of the page without showing our user everything. So hopefully they are none the wiser. Fingers crossed. And there's it working on what is quite clearly that was actually taken at 7:10 this morning, as you can see, because I realised I didn't have a screenshot for that slide. Always be better prepared than I am. There you have it. Our cookies are nicely sat on our attacker-controlled server, us being the attacker, of course, ready for us to do whatever we like with them. This payload can be used for most cross-site scripting vulnerabilities and really nicely demonstrates how cookies would be exfiltrated from an authenticated application. This brings it to the fore for clients and allows them to understand exactly how much damage can be caused by attacks like this. Similarly, it makes you as the consultant look really, really good. You went above and beyond in demonstrating exploitability, and no one has to know that it only took you 10 minutes to figure out and write. That can be our little secret. So, part 3 is automation. Now, this is a somewhat unpopular opinion I've found. To be a good pen tester, do you need to know how to code? No, you don't. To be a great one? Absolutely you do. The ability to write your own exploits becomes invaluable when common tools like Burp Suite and Metasploit reach the limit of their capabilities. To demonstrate, I'll explain to you exactly how knowing how to automate tasks is so important. Now, I will share you a kind of code with me style presentation. I'm sure we've all seen those. I don't find them particularly informative, and I've fallen asleep in my fair share. Sorry to all those speakers as well. But I really do want to ram home that learning how to program is a key part of both demonstrating exploitability to clients and improving yourself as a security professional. Now, the second part of that, improving yourself as a security professional, is quite important. What I've found is when I'm talking to people who can program and those that can't, the thought processes of the ones that can program are a lot more streamlined. They're more efficient. They're used to taking incredibly complex programs, breaking them down into constituent parts, we call them subroutines when we're coding, and then solving each constituent part in turn. And it doesn't really matter which programming language you've picked up either, Ruby, Python, Lua. If you want to learn Lua, what's it called, Computercraft in Minecraft? The little robots are programmed in Lua, so that's a fun little way you can learn Lua. That's what I did during lockdown 1. There's JavaScript, there's Go, PHP, any kind of scripting language is invaluable because it allows you to refine your thought process because you're used to doing exactly what I just said, taking a big problem and making it into a lot of smaller ones. It'll make you a lot faster and it'll stop it'll help stop, or at least it's helped stop me stressing out about big things that land on your desk, because you just are able to approach them in a much more cohesive or constructive manner. Now, when has this actually come in useful? Well, there was a security assessment that I was performing, it must have been about 5 months ago now, where they had valid username enumeration, and you could brute force accounts, and they had a pretty weak password policy. And I was explaining, as part of the formal written part of the report, that this is quite a serious issue. Somebody could probably go off and automate that. And the person on the other end of the phone, or other end of the Zoom call, as I think it was at the time, said, there's absolutely no way you can do that, which I can tell you now is the worst thing to say to a pen tester, because they're going to go off and do it. And so I did. It took maybe half a day, but you can start to, but it really helped them understand what the actual severity of these vulnerabilities were as part of an attack chain. So we've moved away from just simply a vulnerability and how you exploit it to how you chain vulnerabilities together and exploit them all in tandem. So first what we did was there was a username enumeration flaw whereby an account claimed it was locked out, but it wasn't. It didn't send an email, and if you had a correct password, it didn't actually lock the account out. So all it did is I grabbed a really large word list that I'd generated from LinkedIn. We've got the format of the email through some open source intelligence. I'm sure there's some great talks today about OSINT. I will recommend you go and see. We generated this big long thing, and we just hammered each of them with five passwords. They were password 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if it then said the account had been locked out, we passed that along to the second part of the program, which then tried to brute force it. We had a series of reused passwords that we'd found on various online services, such as Dehashed and things like that. And that's what the second part of the program did. And then the third part of the program was, after we'd successfully authenticated, and we did actually successfully breach an account, it went off and just, using Selenium, just generated a screenshot of their account profile page. Needless to say, we did then upload that we sent that over to the client, and they went, right, thank you. That's properly explained exactly how we were going to go out and exploit this. And that's just one example of where that's come into play. Having this ability to interact with web applications, or even as an infrastructure person, having that ability to interact with things in a way that you define and you control is incredibly important. And it means that when you're going off and exploiting these things, or rather trying to explain them to somebody who doesn't really understand what you're talking about, as unfortunately some people in information security don't, it gives you that breadth of knowledge, or rather that depth of knowledge, because you have to know what every little part of this thing's doing because you're writing it. Unless you stole it off Stack Overflow, which I have done a couple of times. Right then. Getting the two arms of security to work together. Now, I promised the tattoos have absolutely nothing to do with Red and Blue Team. That was just an accident, but it worked quite nicely here, so here we go. I've given a lot of information here about the ways we can all improve the methods by which we demonstrate to clients how something is exploitable. Now, I'm going to put my client or Blue Team hat on and give some advice to that side of the debate. The best thing that you can remember, and to be fair, the same goes for the Red Team individuals too, is that we're all on the same side of this fight. You may have spent years developing the solution, but any good pen tester will be just as invested, maybe not just as invested, but definitely invested, in making said solution as secure as it possibly can be. Now, that doesn't mean you have to take them at face value. A series of certificates makes for a pretty looking office wall, but if they can't properly give detailed explanations of the vulnerabilities they're exploiting, then they're just decorative. They're just certificates. Feel free to ask questions like, how would a legitimate threat actor exploit this? What's the most damage that could be caused by this vulnerability? Can you give examples of that? And most importantly, if you see Alert 1 in a report, send them this video, or at the very least, demand an explanation of what can be done with it. Do we have any questions? But I have to repeat them for the purposes of this. So what language did I use for that automation example I just gave? I used Python. I'm a big fan of it. It's the coding language that I picked up when I was first in there. However, if you're just having to pick up one programming language and you're going into pen testing, I'd actually recommend Ruby. It's a lot kinder to people who are picking it up. It's a lot friendlier. It can do all the same stuff Python can do. It's just a lot nicer language to interact with. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, go on. Yeah, go on.
How would you kind of demonstrate that kind of proof of concept in the ways you're talking, like when you're rules engagement a bit more kind of restrictive?
Okay, so how can you demonstrate exploitability when you have really restrictive rules of engagement? It really depends how restrictive you're talking about there. Like, if that's a very, very open-ended question. I've never been involved in engagements where they've banned me from exploiting cross-site scripting, for example, or things like that. Sometimes you have problems with brute forcing and things like that, but that's generally only... do you have any examples of when really restrictive rules of engagement?
Things like SQL injection, not wanting to get into databases and those things.
Oh, right. Just go as far as they'll let you in that case. So the example given was SQL injection and not being allowed to access databases. I completely understand why a client probably wouldn't want you snooping around their database. They might have stuff in there that they might not want getting out into the public. But try and make sure that you're not just doing like a single quote and a 500 server error. See if there's any ways you can move past that. And that, again, that opens up another can of worms of how you do that. Do you have server-side request forgery, for example? Can you start to interrogate open ports from the internal? There's a lot to play with, but try not to do the single quote 500 server error thing.
Oh. How did you see you managed to resolve the cross-site scripting issue?
Resolve it?
Yeah.
As in give remediation advice?
Like, so essentially, like, when you do find a vulnerability, obviously, like, it's annoying to get rid of it. Like, how did you manage to get rid of that or go back into production?
Right. So, the question was, how do you give remediation advice specifically for the cross-site scripting vulnerability I was discussing there? We recommended like a series of character encoding. So you ban certain, have a blacklist of certain things that can't be doing there. And then also the part of the URL specifically for this that was being reflected didn't have to be. You could have stored that in a cookie. So we just got them to change it and then it was no longer being reflected. Any more for any more? Oh, great. Well, thank you for listening to me. And remember, always chase the rabbit. Thank you.